Well, hello, my dears, and welcome. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to learn a stitch pattern called the mock cable ribbing. So there's a couple things going on here. One is it looks like cable stitching, but it isn't. So there is no cable needle required, which makes it super easy to do. And then because it's ribbing, just like the ribbing below, it's stretchy and it functions like a ribbing. So this is fun for hats, socks, I would say cuffs of sweaters, or in this case, fingerless gloves. Now we have a fingerless glove pattern that our friendly host is going to put the link in the chat for you to download the free pattern. So the instructions that I'm using are coming off that pattern. I'm not going to make a whole pair of fingerless mitts on camera, but we are going to work on the mock cable ribbing stitch. Now, the other thing I want to point out, we're doing this in the round. So I'm using double pointed needles. If I was making a hat or something bigger, I could use circular needles. And you can also do this stitch in rows, but that's not what we're doing today. So, friendly host, if we could switch back to my hand camera and I will fix the lights. Perfect. And if you all just heard that big clunk, that was my knitting needle falling on the ground. So let me fish that off of the floor and we'll get started. Again, if you're following along with the pattern, of course the instructions are right there, but if you are working this stitch pattern into something else, you want to cast on a multiple of 5 stitches. Now 3 stitches are going to be knit facing on the right side and 2 are going to be purl. So for the purposes of these fingerless mitts, it began with a knit 3 purl 2 ribbing. And so again, I'm not going to be able to make the whole fingerless mitt here on camera, but that's how it would start out if you were making that project. And I have my little stitch marker here to remind me where the beginning of the round is. I know that some people like to mark the needle, not the stitching, but when I'm working in the round, I always feel like it falls off, especially in double pointed needles. It's always on the floor and never where I need it. So I do mark the first stitch of the round, and I don't bother to move it up every single round. I know how many stitches are on each needle, so I just need to make sure I know which is the first needle. So we're going to do a 4 round repeat. And again, if you have any questions as we're going along, please ask them in the chat and they will be conveyed to me and I will answer them just as best as I can. So the first thing we're going to do is slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back. So my yarn is in the back. I'm slipping 1 purlwise. Remember, when we slip one, we move it from one needle to the next without increasing or decreasing or knitting or anything else. Now I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches. My yarn's already in the back, so I'm not going to have any problem there. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2, and then I'm going to pass the first stitch, the slipped stitch, over the 2 knit stitches. So PSSO, whenever you see it, your pattern will tell you specifically how many and when, but PSSO stands for pass slipped stitch over. So I'm going to take my slipped stitch and I'm going to pull it over the 2 knit stitches that I just made. So I've taken that from 3 to 2. I've made my little crossbar here. Now I'm going to purl 2. One thing that helps you read your knitting on this pattern in particular is the purl 2s are consistent. No matter what round you're on, purl 2 is purl 2, unless you're in the thumb gusset, but that's a different discussion. So we're going to move our yarn to the back. We're going to slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back, knit 2, 1, 2, PSSO, pass slipped stitch over. So in this case, I'm going to take that first stitch and pass it over the 2 that I have knit. And then we're going to purl 2. If you guys would bear with me 1 second, I want to adjust the camera. This is a very strange angle at which at which to be knitting with circular needles. Okay, I think that's going to work a little better. All right, slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back, knit 2. Here's my yarns over here. If you're not used to knitting on circular needle, or if you're not used to knitting on double pointed needles like I am here, it's a good habit to get into to give that first stitch on your next needle a little extra tug, because those tend to get loose when you jump from one needle to the next. We call that laddering. It is not a good thing if you're not doing it on purpose. Slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back, knit 2, 1, 2, PSSO. Now, the other thing I want to point out with that PSSO, because I'm passing over 2, I don't want those 2 stitches to fall off the end. So when I'm passing over, you can see with my right hand, I'm holding on to that working yarn sort of with a death grip. I'm not necessarily trying to make that stitch any tighter, but I do want to make sure that when I'm doing that PSSO that it's not going to fall off the end. Now, if I have made it tighter, I can loosen it up right there. But I want to keep those knit stitches that I am passing over, I want to keep them from falling off the end of my needle. Now I'm doing the smallest size in your written pattern, and they recommended DK yarn and a size 5 needle. I had worsted weight laying around, so that's what we're using. And I went up to a 7. So again, we're mostly interested in learning this stitch. The fingerless gloves are secondary to my use today, but again, if you'd like to have that pattern, there will be a link in the chat. All right, we're coming up to the end of the round. Slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back, knit 2, PSSO, holding on to that working yarn so those stitches don't fall off. Purl 2. And then here's my last repeat. Slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back, knit 2, PSSO, holding on to that working yarn so those stitches don't fall off. Ah, and I lost one. See what happened? I wasn't holding on tight enough. I'm going to take this, I'm going to give that a little tug, pass them over, and then purl the last 2. Purl 2. 1, 2. So this is the end of my first round. Now, something I want to point out to you is you will notice that I have fewer stitches on my needle now than I did when I started. So in this case, I was working on 35 stitches. That's 7 groups of 5. So I have 7 fewer stitches than I started with. Now we don't need to worry. I'm going to put them back on the next round. But if you're just learning this stitch, I don't want you to panic that your stitch count is off. So if you're doing a bigger piece, again, you're sitting at home, you're using this stitch for a hat maybe or something else, the number of stitches you will decrease is 1 for every 5. So however many groups of 5 you have cast on, each one of those 5 stitch groups will go down to 4. So now for round 2, we're going to go ahead and put those stitches back. So let's take a look and see how that looks. So for round 2, I'm going to knit, yarn over, knit. Whoops, got caught there. Purl 2, because remember I said the purl 2 was consistent in this stitch pattern, and in these fingerless gloves it's consistent everywhere except perhaps on the thumb gusset. So I'm going to take my yarn to the back so I can knit. I'm going to knit the first stitch, that's 1, and now I'm going to yarn over. So I'm going to bring the yarn between the 2 needles and over the right hand needle, which creates an additional stitch. Now I'm going to knit the next stitch. So we took the 2 stitches that we had and we took them back to 3. I'm going to purl 2. 1, 2. Let's do that a couple more times. Need a little bit more yarn here. Knit 1. Give that first stitch a tug because it's the first one on the next needle. So knit 1, give that yarn a tug. Yarn over, bring the yarn between the needles and over the right hand side. Knit 1. Purl 2. Knit, yarn over, knit. Purl 2. Purl 2. Knit, yarn over, knit. So there was our knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, purl 2, 1, 2. So I'm going to go ahead and do this all the way around, which is going to complete my second round. Once again, if you have any questions, now is a really good time to ask before I disappear back into the ether. All right, here's our last repeat. See, we have 4 stitches. We're going to take it back up to 5. Knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, purl 2. Again, in addition to putting that stitch back where we needed it to be, that yarn over creates this little opening in the center of our detail. And it does honestly look like a cable stitch. You just get the extra added benefit of not having to use a cable needle. So for rounds 3 and 4, all we're going to do, we want to add some height now. So all we're going to do is knit 3, purl 3 all the way around. We're going to do that for 2 rounds. So we have a question that says, what made you decide to use metal needles? I have wooden ones. Would this still work? Sure, wooden ones will absolutely work. There's a couple things about the material of your needles, and sometimes it is just personal preference. I like metal needles, so I use them. You like wooden needles, you can use them. Now, there are certain instances in which I prefer one material over another. So for example, if I'm using a really like a super slick or slippery yarn or something that has a lot of fuzz or eyelash or novelty, I am more likely to use a wooden needle than a metal one because I want the wood of the needle to grasp the super fussy yarn and keep it from popping it off the end. So sometimes there is a specific reason why you would use one material of needle over another. But a lot of times, and especially today, since I'm just working in a worsted weight acrylic yarn, it's simply a matter of personal preference. I like metal needles, so I use them. So your wooden ones are going to work just fine. And if I was knitting a hat instead of fingerless gloves, I would use a circular. I wouldn't use double points until I had crown decreases, and I had to. I am not somebody who is allergic to double pointed needles. I don't hate them, and I knit all my socks on them. But honestly, for most people, I think circular needles are a lot easier to manage. So I hope that helped answer your question. Now, one thing I want to point out, again, especially if you're a new knitter, When you knit into the yarn over that you've made, you knit it just like you knit it into a regular stitch. And you do have that big opening, and that is a-okay. That's exactly what we want to happen. But if you're not used to knitting into yarn overs, it might feel a little weird to you. So that is an okay thing that has happened. Don't panic. But that big yarn over is going to make that big opening, which is adding to the decorative nature of our stitch. And then we're going to do our fourth round. And our fourth round, once again, is knit 3, purl 2. And it looks exactly like we did before, only this time we don't have a yarn over. We just have regular stitches. So we do have another interesting question, which I am going to answer while I knit this fourth round. Is it beginner friendly to use 4 needles like this? It seems a bit intimidating. So here's the thing with double pointed needles. If you learned how to knit socks on them like I did, then they're not intimidating at all. Is it a lot more to handle 4 than 2? Yes. But here's the thing. Circular needles can make a tube that's only but so small. Excuse me one second. I kick up a lot of yarn fumes when I'm teaching. So I'm looking to see if I have any other samples in the pile of mess that is my studio. So if, for example, I'm knitting a hat, and your hat starts at the bottom, and I'm knitting away on a circular needle, and I'm going to do some crown decreases, and the hat gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. When I get to about here, I'm not going to be able to do that on a circular needle unless I use magic loop, because the circular needle is simply too long to accommodate such a small number of stitches. And so you most often use double pointed needles when you are doing something. So if I use double pointed needles, I can make that circle smaller and smaller and smaller until it disappears. And a set of double pointed needles will accommodate any size circle. Now, there are hat patterns that you can do that have sort of a big gather at the top, so you don't have to go down that far. There are ways to knit without using double pointed needles, like magic loop, which is a completely different technique. And as with everything else in knitting, some of that is personal preference. I personally do not care for magic loop, or magic loop in knitting. And that's where you use a circular needle with an insanely long cord, like 39 to 42 inches. And every time you knit half of the stitches that you need to knit, you adjust where the cord lies. To me, that's slower than this, but I think a lot of that is because this is how I learned to knit socks, and I am an avid sock knitter. So double pointed needles do not offend me. I don't know if I was a brand new beginning knitter, if a double pointed needle project would be the first thing I picked up. But the other thing about knitting that I find fascinating is what's easy for one person is hard for the next person, and vice versa. Everybody has their own particular things that resonate with them in their mind, and their brain works really well doing that. And then there's their best friend sitting next to them, that doesn't resonate with them, but something else might. So that was a pretty long-winded way of saying I don't know that I would do my very first project on double pointed needles, but it's not as scary as it looks. You do get the hang of it. Like anything else, it's practice. And the thing that a double pointed needle will give you is the world's smallest circle. You can go down to nothing. So the crown of your hat or the toe of your socks. And the other thing so it'll give you that invisible circle. But of course, the other thing is no seams. So there are no seams in a thing that you have knit in the round. So when you're done, you're done. All right, do we have any other questions? Because I feel like we have covered our mock cable stitch. So if we have any more questions, now's a really good time to ask. And just briefly, if I was going to go ahead and finish knitting this fingerless mitt that we gave you the pattern for, what it's telling you is to maintain pattern as established. And the other thing that that means is no matter what's going on elsewhere, if I'm on row 2, I'm on row 2. If I'm on row 4, I'm on row 4. If I'm doing a pattern that has 18 rounds in the repeat, if I'm on round 16, I'm on round 16. So what would happen if you were going to go ahead and make the fingerless gloves? You're going to start adding stitches at the end of one needle, and they're going to grow out, and they are not going to be in the stitch pattern. Most often for an easier fingerless glove or a mitten pattern, you'll find that the thumb is in stockinette stitch. And the reason is it's a little tedious to try and work a thumb gusset in a pattern stitch, because as you add a small amount of stitches for every round, and then your piece comes out to the side. If you're trying to add stitches and then also incorporate that into a stitch pattern, it can get a little confusing. So for these, which are called the Luminance fingerless mitts, for this pattern, that little thumb gusset is going to be in stockinette. And then eventually what happens, you keep adding stitches, adding stitches, adding stitches, so you have sort of a wedge here. Eventually what's going to happen is you're going to skip all of those stitches and go back to working just around the hand, and that's going to take you back to where you were at the beginning. So just briefly, here's my fingerless mitt. I'm going to add my stockinette stitches here at the end of one of the needles, and then when I'm finished all that, here, let's see, now I'm really going crazy. When I'm finished all that, my thumb will be over here. It'll have its own piece of fabric. I may put a border on that. I may not. I think this pattern does have a border. And then I'm going to go back to these stitches and finish off my hand, and I'm going to not use those thumb stitches to the very, very end. All right, if you want to go to my face, friendly host, so I can say goodbye, I will do that. So thank you. Oh, let's get the lights out of the way. It's always an adventure here in the studio. I want to thank you so much for joining me. I am Mary Beth Temple, and I like to hang out with you guys and teach you how to knit things. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again here real soon. Bye-bye.